Hey everybody, I hope you all are well. Enjoyed talking to some of you this morning and uh, reading your contributions to the discussion board. The slideshow that you're about to see is about basically the plot of part 5 of Portrait of the Artist. You should have finished Portrait of the Artist by now. Hopefully you have. If you haven't, well, let me know. And if you have lost or forgotten or left your book, the entire text of Portrait of the Artist is available online. Just search for it. But I'm going to walk through the plot of Portrait of the Artist just to tell you what's happening point by point and also give you some insight into some key moments in the text. Then later this week, I'm going to present another slideshow that will tell you something about the style of the book and give some insights into how the style of the book works and why it's important. And hopefully this will become a springboard for you to be able to perform a style analysis of a work of literature, that is your long paper. So let's go. So I've got several parts to this. There's going to be 7 slides walking through the chapter. And as you see at the top, this first one is about the first part, and I've keyed it to the page numbers in the edition that you have for the class. If you don't have that edition, I'm sorry about that, but the divisions are more or less apparent. Not all of them are marked by a break in the text or an asterisk or anything like that. In fact, in this chapter, fairly few of them are. But, you know, the first 18 pages are a brief introduction to Stephen. You'll see at the end of chapter 4, he had that kind of vision and he knew he was going to be an artist. We jump forward to him in college. He is at what's called University College Dublin. This is the Catholic University in Dublin. The first part of the book sort of sets up what Stephen's like. He's college age, and there are 3 people that he talks with in this part of the chapter. He talks with his family, his father, his mother, some siblings, with this guy Davin, who is a nationalist classmate, meaning a kind of a person who's all about fighting for the liberation of Ireland, and you'll see some other people like that. And then he talks with a priest. Each of these parts reveals something about his character, and each of them, in a sense, poses a different kind of challenge to him as an individual. And, you know, the one part of this that's important is this section where the priest, who's the dean of studies, I think, at the university, asks him for a funnel. Stephen doesn't know what a funnel is. Of course, you and I know what a funnel is, but they have this conversation about whether it's a funnel or a tundish, and whether tundish is an Irish word. That's the word that Stephen knows. This will come up later, but you know, it has to do with the who is Irish. The language is English, of course, that Stephen speaks, and in Irish nationalism of this time, the idea that you should know Irish was really important. And the priest that he's talking to, the dean of studies, is not from Ireland. He's a Catholic priest, but he's not from Ireland. He's English, and so that's sort of why he's able to say this, right? On page 204. The priest is asked for has mentioned a funnel, and Stephen says at the bottom of 203, "What funnel?" The priest says, "The funnel through which you pour the oil into your lamp." "That," said Stephen, "is that called a funnel? Is it not a tundish?" "What's a tundish?" "Tundish. That, the funnel," Stephen says. "Is that called a tundish in Ireland?" asked the dean. "I never heard the word in my life." Well, you know, so this gives us the knowledge that the priest there, though Catholic, is not himself Irish. And if you think of this, family, nationalist discourse, and religion, and nation are all things that Stephen is trying to avoid being caught by. And we've seen that over and over and over again in this book. The next passage, which is roughly corresponds to to pages 206 to 220, there are arguments with his classmates over nationalism and religion. These are all very smart people. They can all like joke in Latin and speak Latin, make little Latin comments to each other. This is typical of Catholic education at the period. These are university students, so they're among the smartest students. Most people don't go to university. And at one point, they're having an argument about nationalism, and one of Stephen's friends, Davin, says nation comes first. Ireland comes first. Ireland before you can be a poet or a mystic. And Stephen says, this is a very famous passage, the passage in yellow here. Do you know what Ireland is? Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow. That is the mother pig that eats her children. Ireland is the mother that eats her children. This is a very kind of negative picture of Ireland. Ireland is not the mother, but the mother betrayer for Stephen. But it gives you a sense of Stephen as being an individual, not a joiner, someone who's refusing to join movements or causes. And that's one of his big characteristics here. Of course, he's been a mover and joiner earlier when he converted and he decided he was maybe going to join the priesthood. Well, that was his call. But when he decides not to join, he really decides not to join. The next passage is a complicated passage, and you don't need to get it all. Okay, so let me just say, if it all seems very complicated, his aesthetic theory, this is stuff Joyce is working out. This conversation with Lynch you don't need to know it all. But I do think there are some lovely passages here, and this famous passage, again in yellow here, the artist, Stephen says, like the God of the creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. This is, as it were, Joyce, the artist of this book, who is, well, is he expressing himself or is he refined out of existence? And then at the end of that section on 235, he's going to meet with somebody who is presumably a girl, and we have this girl who is kind of vague here, might be even the Eileen of the very beginning of the book, but we don't know. But there is clearly a woman in the case here who he meets at the end, or is about to meet at the break on 235. The fourth part of the chapter goes to the next morning. We don't know what's happened in between. He may have met and made love with this girl in the meantime. This section, which takes about 8 pages, is essentially about him composing a poem, which is in the form of a villanelle, which is a kind of poem that has strictly repeated lines in certain order. The most famous villanelle that you might know is by Dylan Thomas, which is the one that goes, do not go gentle into that good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And those lines repeat over and over again in alternate patterns and then come together. In this case, the two lines that keep coming back are you not weary of ardent ways and tell no more of enchanted days. So Stephen's not as good a poet as Dylan Thomas, but the section ends with the complete poem. We see it in little bits, and then finally he writes the complete poem. So we have some relationship between his love relationship, maybe after he's met the girl and done something, and then we have his composing the poem. The next section, which is about 15 pages, has more banter among students. Stephen's very good friend Cranley. Cranley and Lynch are probably the two most important characters who talk with Stephen. They're friends. Like Stephen, they're very smart. Like Stephen, they're very skeptical to some degree. Cranley, though, is more. Oh, I've misspelled Cranley on the slide. It doesn't have an E. People going back and forth. a lot of people trying to get Stephen to be more nationalist, and he's refusing it. Temple is this guy who seems to think a lot of Stephen. He's like a hanger-on, a guy who just would like to be a disciple of Stephen. So you can see that Stephen, although, you know, you can look at him in this chapter as a kind of an arrogant jerk. I certainly do in a lot of ways. Yet he does have admirers. And Stephen seems to command a lot of respect, even though he's clearly a heretic. Now, this section goes into the next section pretty seamlessly, and that's where, but I'm placing it in a different slide because it's more important. There's just the last 10 pages of this conversation are just Stephen and Cranley. And there's some beautiful stuff with Cranley, and much discussion of religion and motherhood, Stephen's own relationship with his mother, whether Stephen is willing to risk hell in order to be the artist he wants to be. And in fact, he says he is. So throughout the chapter, he is presented as a kind of an arrogant, standoffish person in a lot of ways, but he's also, you know, fairly, I don't know, brave, you might say, within the context of the book. And at the end of the chapter, he says to Cranley, "Look here, Cranley, you have asked me what I would do and what I would not do. I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call myself my home, my fatherland, or my church. And I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning." And if you look at this whole section, this whole conversation with Cranley, the other thing that's going on here is he's making the decision to leave Ireland, making the decision to break off with his family and to leave Ireland and try to become the artist that he wants to be. Everybody thinks of him as a potential artist, but he hasn't really written much except for that one little not very good villanelle. So, well, what will he or won't he? That is an interesting question. So the chapter ends in the first person, which is different from anything else in the book. He switches to diary mode. And so the last part of the chapter, the last part of the book, is a series of diary entries. There's a discussion of Irish, the Irish language, the English language. He finds out that tundish is not an Irish word, but an English word. And, you know, it's one of these moments where he feels like he doesn't know anything at all. He really is still new. He breaks off kind of with his girlfriend. Again, she doesn't have a name, and that's one thing that's interesting about the book, is that the book really presents Stephen's point of view, but doesn't really have anything about the girl, gives whether it's the same girl or different girls at different points in the book. I should say woman at this point, since he's a college student. And then at the end, he's told his mother that he's going to go, and he says, "Welcome, O life." Well, mother's putting my new second-hand clothes in order. She prays now, she says, that I may learn in my own life and away from home and friends what the heart is and what it feels. Amen, so be it. Welcome, O life. So here he's writing himself into a kind of excitement. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race, which I think he means the Irish race, or maybe the human race. And then he says at the end, "Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead." Who's the old father? Who's the old artificer? Well, that's probably Daedalus. That is his namesake, the father Daedalus. And you may remember that Daedalus in Greek myth is the great inventor, the father of Icarus, the person who invented the labyrinth of the Minotaur that held the Minotaur. And so he's an artificer, he's a maker of artificial things. And so he's sort of praying to Daedalus, to this mythical father figure. He's certainly not referring to his own father, who's not much of a person at this point. Is he praying to God? Well, that's another question. But anyway, I just wanted to give you that summary of what the book does in these last parts, and then we'll talk about style later in the week. Thanks. Bye.